slot to Sir David King. Thank you.
Judith, thank you very much. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. The WUN is, in my view, an exemplary body, and so being invited to speak to you is a delight as well as an honour. I'm going to be talking to you. Do I have control of this? Perhaps I do. I'm going to be speaking to you about, I'm taking a very broad view of the state of the world. And that broad view is really represented out of my experience in that initial period as Chief Scientific Advisor to the British government. What happened to me very early on was, or what happened to Britain, was the arrival of the biggest foot and mouth disease epidemic that the world had ever seen, 2001. And our Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Fisheries, which disappeared as a result of what I'm going to tell you, set about dealing with this by taking out the 1967 lessons learned from a previous foot and mouth disease epidemic and applying that. Now, the epidemic was out of control in the sense that it was growing exponentially despite the application of these measures. And so alarm was rising. We were getting about 50 new farms going down with the epidemic per day. And more than that, the Prime Minister had been planning to have an election in about that time. So as he said in his autobiography subsequently, he was in a bit of a state. So I set up a small team, independent of any request, because to be honest, at this point, I was in post for 3 months. I hadn't even met the Prime Minister yet. I'd set up a team of epidemiologists, modelers, veterinarians, to advise me on how this disease ought to be managed. And I was going outside government, not into ministries, outside government to the university sector for this group of expertise. And within about 3 or 4 days, we had modeled the epidemic using 2 different epidemiological models. And I'm very happy to answer questions about this. Because these 2 models were so different, it gave me a lot of confidence because the 2 models were giving very similar output. What we showed was that with the policies in place, the epidemic would come under control only when half of the animals in the United Kingdom had been culled. In other words, it wouldn't be under control, it would just be less animals around to collect the disease. And we played with a computer model and we came up with a new method of dealing with this. But when I say we played with it, this was 24/7 in real time. The epidemic was simply paralyzing the country. And I went in to see the Prime Minister and I showed him the output of the modeling. I said, well, we've played around with every possible control procedure and here's one that really works. Nobody else, of course, had seen the Prime Minister with a solution. And so as he says in his autobiography, he didn't understand a word of what I was saying, except that I seemed to have a solution. So he said, right, you're in charge. It was a fairly nerve-wracking time because he also said, and you're going on television and radio to explain what you're doing. This was the politicians saying, put the white coat out there because I'm not sure if he's right. And if he's wrong, it's going to be his job that goes, not mine. I'm being literal about this, by the way. So the main point is that within 2 days of my taking control, we turned exponential growth into exponential decay. And the date of the election was shifted by the Prime Minister, who looked at my graphical outputs on a linear output. He said, is that really going to 0 on June the 6th? I said, well, yes, there's still going to be a few. He said, no, but do you have any faith in this graph? I said, yes. He said, right, I'm going to call an election on June the 6th. So I think it's the first time in British history anyway that an election date was chosen on the basis of an epidemiological plot.
If you win.
He won. And to be honest, The data points came in after this graph and simply followed it with amazing precision, far better than anyone should have expected. So it was an interesting point because, and the reason I'm raising this is twofold. I decided I never wanted to be in this position again in my new job, because I didn't have a moment's peace. I was meeting the Prime Minister every day for about 8 weeks. I was flown in a helicopter around the country to see that the new policy was being imposed, and I was meeting the science team every day. So it was a 24/7 job. And I just thought part of the problem is we hadn't actually seen how things had changed from 1967 to 2001, but nor had we any means of plumbing into the capability within our research teams around the world who had really understood the issues. In other words, what government was plugged into was the people who were hired in the ministry, right? And I had created a new system which was to use the academic knowledge base, which is very new and modern and so on, leading, cutting edge. And so what I set about doing was creating a new foresight process in government. So the foresight process that I ran for 7 years, the head of the civil service said to me afterwards, there's no other piece of government had as much impact on government policy. We were looking medium to long term into the future, by which I mean between 10 years and 80 years into the future in terms of what the demands were.